behalf of the Fairfield Heritage Association, I would like to welcome you here this evening to the Court of Inquiry of Lancaster's most famous son, General William Tecumseh Sherman. Proudly claimed and remembered by this, his hometown community, and widely regarded throughout the North and by eminent historians as a brilliant military strategist and as one of the prime architects of Union victory in our great American Civil War. His campaigns to take Atlanta and the subsequent march to the sea and through the Carolinas are widely recognized as military masterpieces and are still studied by military academies throughout the world. Notwithstanding this, General Sherman was and still is regarded in large parts of the South as a military freebooter, a villain who is responsible for terrorizing and bringing the excesses of war down upon the heads of innocent civilians. A general whose army is accused of indiscriminate pillaging, arson, and other actions which fall far outside the civilized norm. This controversy has continued unabated to the present day, as evidenced by the recent spate of letters of an acrimonious and heated nature to local papers during the recent dedication of the nearby Sherman statue. Some letters proclaim him to be a great general, a hero to his country. Conversely, others claim he was little better than a war criminal. So our purpose here this evening is to hopefully explore the allegations of misconduct against General Sherman arising from his wartime activities and those of his troops, to separate fact from fiction, and to hopefully tonight, after listening to all the evidence, reach a reasoned verdict as to the reputation of General William Tecumseh Sherman. Now, the vehicle by which we hope to accomplish this tonight is the Court of Inquiry. Now, this was a procedure authorized by the Articles of War which were in existence at the time of General Sherman. They were the forerunner of the modern-day Manual for Court-Martials, the code of laws and regulations that govern the conduct of military personnel. Now, it is essential to remember throughout this proceeding that a court of inquiry is not a court-martial, which is a military criminal proceeding. Rather, it was a means whereby an officer in the United States Army whose name or reputation was under a cloud through informal accusations either by brother officers, the public, or the press, could request a hearing for the purpose of clearing their name. Now, realistically speaking, General Sherman never felt compelled during his lifetime to request such a hearing. However, there were a number of significant courts of inquiry immediately thereafter the Civil War, the most notable being that of General Fitz-John Porter and General Gouverneur Warren, who were relieved of their command during the Civil War, and that of Major Marcus Reno, who was second in command of the famed 7th Cavalry, who was alleged did not expeditiously try to come to the relief of his commander, George Custer, in that tragic battle on the banks of the Little Bighorn. Now, notwithstanding that it is not a criminal proceeding, a court of inquiry still essentially was a judicial proceeding, and the rules that govern courts pretty much are in play here. Hearing the case would be a 3-officer panel called the Court of Inquiry, which will be seated up here. They essentially were both the jury and the judge in this matter. There would be a military judge advocate appointed to present the evidence against General Sherman, the prosecution, if you will. A judge advocate, of course, being a military officer who is also an attorney. Likewise, a judge advocate would have been detailed to represent General Sherman and to present his defense. An added feature tonight, and it was available at this time, is that General Sherman could, and in fact did for this hearing, retain civilian counsel to assist him in this matter. Likewise, there is a civilian attorney who is helping with the prosecution. Now, as in most cases, the prosecution goes first, presents their evidence and documents supporting their version of the charges first, followed by the defense. At the conclusion of the evidence and presentation of it, Then both sides will be given an opportunity to give a closing argument to summarize their view of what the evidence says. Following this, the court, the three officers who are either equal to or senior in rank to the officer who stands accused, will retire for secret deliberations in order to return a finding on each of the charges. Now, the standard of evidence which was used in these proceedings was not the beyond a reasonable doubt that we're all familiar with for criminal proceedings. It was a lesser standard of evidence, a clear and convincing standard. It's somewhat lesser, although a strict standard. And in order to find that General Sherman in this case is in effect guilty of the charges, the Board of Officers has to unanimously decide that there is clear and convincing evidence to support each of the charges. Now, if they do so find on one or all the charges, then they come back with a finding that the charge is proved. If they find that the evidence is insufficient, then they must return a finding of not proved. If they did so find that it was not proved, then the officer was considered to have their name and reputation cleared. Now, that's not to say that the officer who had requested the hearing, in this case General Sherman, didn't run some sort of risk by requesting the hearing. Why there would be no loss of life, liberty, or rank that you would find in a criminal proceeding like a court-martial, if the court finds that there is sufficient evidence to prove one or any of the charges and finds that it's a violation of the Articles of War, they could and should, along with their written findings, send up a recommendation to the Secretary of War to request that a court-martial be convened to try General Sherman on these charges. So go back in time with me now, if you will, to the early 1870s, a time when this country is still fresh with the scars from its great Civil War, a time when Lancaster's own General William T. Sherman is at the apex of his career, having recently been appointed to be the commanding general of the United States Army. A time when General Sherman, stung by accusations and innuendos and rumors regarding his wartime conduct, in an attempt to clear his name and facilitate his role as commanding general of the United States Army, has requested and been granted a court of inquiry into these matters. Now, the charges in this case are fairly well summed up into four distinct categories. Now, the adjutant, when we begin the official part of the trial, will go in more length when he reads those charges, but they can essentially be summed up as four. One, that General Sherman allowed and ordered the targeting of civilian targets and bombardment of them within the city of Atlanta, and that waged unnecessary warfare on innocent non-combatant civilians, i.e., that he ordered the burning of Atlanta and the forcible evacuation of its civilian population, thereby turning them into helpless refugees. Charge number two would be that he stood by and authorized or implicitly condoned the relentless pillaging, looting, and plundering and burning of a captured and defenseless city, much to the detriment of, its innocent civilian population. And here we are speaking of the famed burning of the city of Columbia, South Carolina. Charge number three, dishonorable treatment of prisoners of war. This refers to an incident in the war where General Sherman was alleged to have utilized captured Confederate prisoners as a vanguard, as a safety net for his troops, and used them to go in front of his troops to clear a Confederate minefield. Charge number four, reprisals and unauthorized pillaging and looting of civilian property and homes for no military use. This, of course, refers to the foraging and tactics used by his troops on their great march to the sea. Each of these charges will be testified to and evaluated tonight, and upon the conclusion, again, not only will the court render its verdict, but you, the audience, will be required, in addition to their official verdict, to render an equally important verdict, the public verdict. Having heard the evidence, you will then be called on, while the official panel is deliberating, called upon to deliberate and render your verdict as to the reputation of General William Tecumseh Sherman. And so, without any further delay, the court of inquiry into the conduct of General William Tecumseh Sherman.
All rise. You may be seated.
Captain Wilson, you may read the convening announcement if you will, please, sir.
The Court of Inquiry is convened pursuant to the Article of War 97 at the authority of Secretary of War Belknap and at the express request of the respondent, General William Tecumseh Sherman. The specific allegations to be considered by this court are as follows. Attack upon undefended locales or undefended civilians causing unnecessary suffering. Allowing pillage or plunder of towns, villages, or other properties. Failing to maintain proper command and control over subordinates. Reprisal and dishonorable treatment of prisoners of war by forcing them to participate in military operations at the risk of life and safety. Reprisals against the persons and properties of non-combatant civilians by confiscating items such as foodstuffs and livestock and essential to the survival of civilian population. The respondent and the following persons detailed to this court are present. President of the Court of Inquiry, Major General Henry Halleck. Court member, Major General Philip Sheridan. Court member, Major General Alpheus Williams. Presenting the case against the respondent is Stephen Davis, Esquire, assisted by Captain Theodore Filer, Judge Advocate. Representing the respondent is James Ryan, Esquire, and assisted by Captain William David Larrick, Esquire.
Thank you, Captain Wilson. Section 547 of the Articles of War provide that members of the Court of Inquiry may be challenged by the party whose conduct is being inquired into. General Sherman, sir, do you know of any matters which might give rise to a challenge to any members of this Court of Inquiry, sir?
No, we do not, sir.
Thank you, counsel. There being no challenge, Captain Wilson, you may now swear in the court.
Do you, General Sheridan, General Halleck, and General Williams, swear that you will well and truly examine and inquire according to the evidence into the matter before you without partiality, favor, affection, prejudice, or hope of reward? So help you God.
I do so swear. It appears that the convening orders are appropriate and in order. Before we proceed, the court would like to make a statement to those in attendance. Before proceeding with this Court of Inquiry, the court would make the following statement to all of those in the courtroom today. The court is not unaware of the sensitivity attendant to the issues which come before the court today, and that there may be testimony which may arouse certain emotions in those attending. The court does hereby admonish those attending that the court will not tolerate any untoward outbursts or comments during the testimony. Anyone so doing will receive a warning from the court. A second violation will result in that person being removed from the courtroom at bayonet point if necessary. Are counsel ready to proceed? Prosecution?
We are, Your Honor.
And defense counsel?
We are, Your Honor.
Prosecution may call its first witness.
We call to the stand Mrs. Mary Burge.
Mrs. Mary Burge.
Do you swear that the evidence you shall give in this case now in hearing shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Mrs. Burge, please state for the court your name and your residence.
My name is Mary Burge. I live on a plantation right outside Covington, Georgia.
And would you tell just a little bit of your background as to why you may be here?
Of course, sir. I'm originally from Kentucky. I came to Covington to teach school. There I met my future husband, Thomas. He was a planter, owned a plantation. We married. I moved to the plantation. Unfortunately, several years later, Thomas passed, and I was left a widow to run the plantation with my boys. That's what I call my slaves. We raised several different crops: cotton, corn, and several others.
And Mrs. Burge, would you state for the court your involvement, encounter, or experiences with the Federal Army under General Sherman's command?
Well, the night before my incident with General Sherman, I could see smoke billowing in the distance from my neighbor's house, so I knew they were close. The next morning, I went out to my gate, and coming towards me were these Yankee soldiers. I stood there in defiance. They swarmed right over me, went into my garden, went into my yard. They were everywhere. First place they went was my smokehouse. They broke the lock, stole hundreds of pounds of meat, sugar, just everything they could get their hands on. There was a young guard standing nearby, and I pleaded with him to stop the thievery. And he said, "Ma'am, those are his orders." Next, they went to my carriage house. First out, Old Dutch. Old Dutch was my husband's buggy horse for years, carried him miles and miles. Next was Mary, my brood mare. She was so old and feeble. Then her colt, my sheep, my mules, all of them. They brought them all out. But then they brought out, one by one, my boys. Some of them, they had the bayonets to their neck. They took everything from their quarters, the money that they had managed to save. And they made the comment, "We take these clothes because these are white people's clothes, not for black people to wear." I turned and went into my house, and they were ravishing it, just everywhere. In my pantry, they were taking my pots and pans. They were taking all my flour sifters. I mean, everything. A young Captain Weber, I believe he was from Illinois, came in, and he saved me. He took pity on me, and he kept them, I know, from burning my house, because they burned my stable and they burned my other buildings. Later that day, General Sherman himself came riding through the back of my plantation with his men, trampling my gardens, knocking down my gates, unnecessary destruction. If I live to be the age of Methuselah, I never want to go through another day like that.
Mrs. Burge, your stress and anguish through these years is palpable. Thank you, madam, for appearing before the court. I have one more question. On your plantation property, among your family or persons living thereon, was there any person engaged in the active support of the Confederacy?
Never, never. That was wanton destruction of innocent victims.
If it pleases the court, we have no further questions of this witness.
Thank you, counsel. Defense may proceed.
Thank you, sir. Mrs. Burge, you testified to the unnecessary taking of stores and the tearing down of fence rails. Mrs. Burge, are you an expert on military necessity?
No, sir, I am not.
Thank you, ma'am. Mrs. Burge, were your crops ever used to feed the Southern armies?
They were sold commercially. I do not know that they were directly sold to the armies.
Therefore, as far as you know, it was possible.
I suppose.
Mrs. Burge, do you have any personal knowledge of any orders issued directly by General Sherman to destroy or confiscate your property?
It seems to me that a general is responsible for the happenings of his army and his men. But no, I do not know directly.
No personal knowledge?
No
then?
personal knowledge.
Thank you, ma'am. That's all I have, sir.
Thank you, counsel. Does the prosecution have anything further of this witness?
No, Your Honor, we do not.
Thank you, Ms. Burge. Does the court, one moment, please. Does the court have any questions, General Williams?
No questions, sir.
General Sheridan, sir?
None, sir.
You may step down. Thank you, ma'am. You may call your next witness.
Prosecution would like to call Mayor James M. Calhoun of Atlanta.
James N. Calhoun.
You swear that the evidence you're about to give in this case now in hearing shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Please, for the court, would you state your name, residence, and occupation?
My name is the Honorable James M. Calhoun, Mayor of Atlanta, Georgia.
And were you mayor of Atlanta in the summer of 1864 when General Sherman and his army were conducting operations in and around the city?
I was indeed, sir.
And did the city and its innocent population come under a constant and merciless bombardment by General Sherman's army during that time?
Counsel, I would have to tell you that it was the most indiscriminate shelling that I have ever witnessed. It was done to incite terror into the hearts of the people in Atlanta. There were no military targets in the city of Atlanta at that time. The army had left, had retreated to the south, yet the shelling continued. The city had non-combatants at the time of the shelling, and there were scores of non-combatants hurt at that time. I've heard that General Sherman claims that one of the reasons that the shells fell on Atlanta was that General Hood, the commanding general of the Confederate forces, had his lines very close to the city. I would tell you, Counselor, that they were long gone when this shelling and the fires began.
To your knowledge, what was General Sherman's role in the forced removal of the population and the subsequent burning and destruction of that city?
I would tell you that General Sherman had a direct role in the bombardment of that city. You can imagine my horror when I learned that the general, his intent was to continue the shelling and to raze the city of Atlanta by fire. I sent a communique to the general with an impassioned plea on behalf of the citizens in Atlanta. And at that time, there were women in a family way, there were women with children, there were an aged population, there were wounded soldiers, there were no combatants. I sent this plea to the general, signed by me and signed by 3 members of our city council. His role that you asked me about was quite clear. I happen to have here the letter that the general sent to me in response to my letter, or my communique. Let me share just a couple of sentences from the general's letter. Gentlemen, I have your letter of the 11th in the nature of a petition to revoke my orders removing all of the inhabitants from Atlanta. I have read it carefully and give full credit to your statements of distress that will be occasioned. He goes on. You cannot qualify war in harsher terms than I will. War is cruelty. and you cannot refine it. Counsel, I'm here to tell you that he gave a whole new meaning to the word cruelty and the bombing and the razing of the great city of Atlanta.
No further questions, sir.
Defense may cross-examine.
Mayor Calhoun, in regard to the alleged Union destruction of Atlanta, isn't it true, sir, that General John Bell Hood, the commander of the Confederate Army in Atlanta, destroyed many Atlanta homes in the defense of that city? And a great part of Atlanta was destroyed when General Hood blew up his own munition train.
First of all, Counselor, that's not, what you're saying is not alleged. It happened. And there are many, many witnesses to attest to that, so it's not alleged. Secondly, it is true that General Hood did blow up a munitions train when the Army decided to move south. It is true that as a result of that munition train blowing up, fires were set in that immediate area. But those fires in that munition train were on the outskirts of the city. It did not result in the fires internally in the city. That came from the shelling.
So, sir, it is your testimony that General Hood did, in fact, rain his own form of destruction upon parts of the city of Atlanta?
No, sir, that is not my testimony. That's your interpretation.
Indeed, sir. Mayor Calhoun, in your testimony, you decry the horror of war being visited upon the city of Atlanta. Yet, sir, isn't it fair to say that you felt no such outrage when Atlanta was shipping trainloads of troops and military supplies to wage war and support destruction in the states of Tennessee and Kentucky?
Counselor, you have to remember that at that time, cities on both sides, north and south, were shipping munitions, shipping soldiers, supplies, etc., for combat reasons, to fight on the battlefield. So I was not outraged that the city of Atlanta chose to send supplies to the battlefield. I was outraged, however, when that man decided to burn my city. William Tecumseh Sherman is an incendiary, he is a radical, he is a damn thief. And I will tell you that he has a hyena soul lurking in the massive corruption that somehow has manifested itself as
Witness will
humanity.
please resume his seat. Those remarks are out of order, and the court will disregard those remarks. You may proceed, counsel.
They're not out of order, they're
So,
honest.
Mayor Calhoun, your testimony is that the horror of war is made tolerable when it supports your own cause.
No, that is not my testimony. Again, that's your
That
interpretation.
seems to be your words.
No, that's
Mayor
your
Calhoun, to
interpretation.
your knowledge, did Confederate Commander John Bell Hood ever ask that Atlanta be made a non-military target, an open city?
To my knowledge, General Hood did not do that, but at the time of the shelling, it was very open because nobody else was there but the individuals that I alluded to earlier in my testimony.
So it is your knowledge that you do not know that it was declared, it was asked to be declared.
I
an
have
open
not
city.
heard that, no.
Thank you, sir. Sir, I have no further questions.
Thank you, counsel. The prosecution have any redirect?
We do not, Your Honor.
Mayor Calhoun, the court would like to address a question to you, sir. Do you agree that General Sherman provided transportation for the inhabitants of Atlanta to the Confederate lines, and that they were permitted to take their personal effects and belongings and their servants, and that no harm was done to women and children, and that removal was without force? Do you agree with me, sir?
General Halleck, is it?
Yes, sir.
General Halleck? I'm sure you've had a very distinguished military career. And I'm sure because of your presence on this panel, you're a very intellectual individual. But the reason you asked that question escapes me totally. For this reason. If you have been in war, sir, you know what the city of Atlanta was facing at that time. And for General Sherman to offer train rides to people and ask the women and the children to take their belongings? Would you mind telling me how they were going to lift their furniture, their trunks, their belongings, et cetera, and board one train with one railway going south? He did that to salve his conscience. And I'm surprised I even say that, because I don't think the man's got a conscience.
Remarks are totally out of order, but your remarks are taken in
You
due
asked the
regard
question,
by
General.
by the court.
You
Anything
asked the
further?
question.
We have nothing further, Your Honor.
Anything further for the prosecution?
Nothing, Your
You
Honor.
may step down, sir.
Thank you.
You may proceed to call your next witness.
If it please the court, the prosecution calls as witness Mr. James Gibbs.
Mr. James Gibbs.
Do you swear that the evidence you shall give in this case now in hearing shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Sir, would you, for the court, state your name and residence?
Yes, sir. I'm James Gannard Gibbs. I'm a proud citizen of Columbia, the capital city of the sovereign state of South Carolina. I'm here today to testify in this courtroom, but I must ask your indulgence due to my illness. I've come here from my sickbed. But I would say this, sir. I would gladly come here from my deathbed, and they could have carried me into the courtroom to testify today. Yes, sir.
Mr. Gibbs, allow me to say on behalf of the prosecution and perhaps the court, we appreciate the strenuous efforts, sir, that you have made in time of distress and illness to see that justice may be served.
Yes, sir.
Please tell us a bit, sir, of your background.
Well, 7 years ago, I considered myself a very fortunate individual. I had a wife who was most charming and delightful. I had a very successful dry goods business, and I felt that my family had earned the trust and respect of our peers in Columbia.
Well, then, let me ask you the more important question. Can you tell us, Mr. Gibbs, about the entrance of General Sherman's Federal Army into the city of Columbia, South Carolina?
Although it grieves me deeply to recall such events, I will endeavor to give you my most truthful recollections of. I recall that General Hampton had decided wisely to take our southern troops and leave the city with respect. And we had heard that General Sherman was at the gates of our city. Now, Mayor Goodwin that morning, on the morning of February 17th, 1865, he got together with his aldermen, and they decided they would go out and meet General Sherman. Their effort was to avoid the calamity that had occurred in Atlanta, and they would rather have endured that which Savannah had enjoyed. So they went out with a white flag and a carriage and met General Sherman at the gates of our city, and they surrendered the city most peacefully. But all of us felt very safe after that point until the Yankee troops started coming into our city with surly remarks and derogatory songs. They were big, raw-boned fellows from places like Michigan and Wisconsin, where I understand they have bears and Indians still in the streets.
Uncivilized, sir.
Yes, oh, definitely. We haven't had bears, Indians in Columbia for many generations. But I would like to say that they also sang a song that I shall never forget because of its prophetic nature, and it was, "Hail Columbia, happy land. You'll be burned or I'll be damned." And that's what happened to our city. But unfortunately, there were a large number of cotton bales in the streets of our city at that time, on the docks and in the streets. And it never did come to my recognition whether it was done by the retreating Confederate troops or by the invading Yankee troops, but that was most unfortunate. But as soon as they entered, without hesitation, they began breaking into establishments and looting. It was just disgraceful. And at that time, I was worried about my wife, who was quite ill, and I hesitated to leave her at home alone. So I prevailed upon a friend, and he stayed with her, and I went down to my emporium, and before I'd ever gotten there, they'd broken the windows and the doors, and they were stealing everything inside. Things they did not even need, sir. Things like white kid gloves and calico and a bird cage, of all things. And they would get tired of those very quickly, and they'd discard them and go on to another home or another business. And finally, I just prevailed upon them to stop, and they threatened me with physical harm. So I had to stop that. And that evening, simultaneously, all over the city, fires began to break out. Almost just amazing. I don't know who gave the signal for that event, but and as I was at home, many of the homes in my neighborhood were burning, and they even burned a church. And one of the rapscallions there with that Yankee army said, "Well, there goes your damn old gospel shop." Well, fortunate my wife was at home, and our home was not destroyed. She was not harmed, but they did destroy our way of life. I've done my best since then to eke out a paltry living working for other persons, but it has changed all of our lives.
Of course, sir. I will ask, to your knowledge, Mr. Gibbs, are you aware of any hostile activity on the part of Confederate forces or any other military instigation that should have entitled the federal forces to do this to your city?
No, sir. I remember overhearing an officer tell me that General Hampton had given instructions to all of his men to depart quickly, to leave no snipers around. There was no military action, no civilian action against these people.
In other words, sir, it came close to an open city, did it not? Thank you. The court thanks you again, Mr. Gibbs, in time of illness. Justice may indeed be served, even up in these parts north of the Ohio River. Thank you, my friend.
Thank you, sir.
No further questions, Your Honor.
Thank you, counsel. You may cross-examine.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Gibbs, do you consider yourself an expert on military necessity?
No, sir. Certainly not.
Thank you. Mr. Gibbs, do you have any personal knowledge of any order given by the respondent, General Sherman, that even intimated that Columbia, South Carolina was to be destroyed or burned?
Well, I don't rightly know about that directly, but I have always heard that a general is responsible for the actions of his troops.
Of course. Mr. Gibbs, do you know what actions were taken by General Sherman and the members of his staff during the night when Columbia, South Carolina burned?
I've heard some reports that they made some efforts to put...
Sir, isn't it true that General Sherman and his staff spent the entire evening organizing
object, Your
troops
Honor.
to fight the fire, to put it out, to save the members
Counsel
of the
is
city of
browbeating the
Columbia?
witness.
Not to
Counsel
my
may be
direct
seated.
knowledge, sir.
I have nothing further.
Thank you, counsel. Any cross-examination? Further direct?
No, sir.
Does the court have any question? General Williams?
I'd like to make a note for the record here, please. This court is not aware of any entity called the, quote, Yankee Army. We're certain you're in reference, sir, to the Federal Army, and the record should so
They're all
reflect.
Yankees to me, sir.
General Sheridan, sir, do you have any questions of this witness?
None, Your Honor.
You may step down, sir, and thank you for your testimony. Prosecution may proceed with this next witness.
In truth, if it please the court, we have ended our witness call, and we will ask the defense to begin calling its witnesses, if it has any, sir.
Thank you, counsel. The defense, ready to proceed with your witnesses?
Yes, we are, Your Honor.
You may call your first witness.
The defense calls Major John Hammond.
Major John Hammond.
do you swear that the evidence you shall give in this case now in hearing shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Major Hammond, would you please state your name, occupation, and place of residence?
John H. Hammond, resident of St. Paul, Minnesota. As a civilian, I'm a civil engineer, and I'm associated with the railroad company in St. Paul.
Sir, would you please relate to the court your relationship with General Sherman during the late War of the Rebellion?
Oh, wait a minute, hold on here. There you go again, counsel, the War of the Rebellion. This is the War of Northern Aggression. Now, let's just remember this.
Will the witness please take your seat, please? I will give you one more warning, sir. One more outburst from you, sir, and I will have you removed from the courtroom at the point of bayonet. You may proceed, counsel.
Thank you, Your Honor. Major Hammond, please state to the court what was your relationship to General Sherman during the late War of the Rebellion, and especially during the Georgia and Carolinas campaigns?
Well, to give you some background, I entered the service of my country in the late War of Rebellion, enlisting as a private in the 5th New York Cavalry. In November of 1861, I was promoted to captain and assigned to the staff of General Sherman as Assistant Adjutant General. The following June, indeed June 9, 1862, I was promoted to Major. I continued as Assistant Adjutant General and became the General's Chief of Staff. It was my overall function to make certain that the General's orders were very specifically reduced to writing and immediately placed into the hands of the field commanders. I was also entrusted with receiving reports and other information from the field and making certain the General was immediately made aware of those reports and information.
Thank you, sir. Were you present with General Sherman and his army when Columbia, South Carolina was occupied?
Yes, as I recall, that was on February 17 of 1865.
As the Chief of Staff for General Sherman, are you aware of any order that was ever issued ordering the burning or destruction of Columbia, South Carolina?
Certainly there was not, sir.
Thank you. Now, Major Hammond, you were a military expert, a trained staff officer. Would you please indicate to the court your impressions and observations in regard to the fires that broke out in Columbia, South Carolina on the evening of which we have been speaking?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to note the contrast between our taking of Savannah and our taking of Columbia. At Savannah, things were quite orderly, virtually without incident, dignified, if you will, as much as that train of events could be dignified. Now then, at Columbia, it was a virtual nightmare. Upon quitting the city, Rebel General Wade Hampton's cavalry tore apart an enormous number of bales of cotton and put them to the torch. Now, I don't believe for 1 second that this was done with evil intent, but most likely was to keep the cotton out of our hands. Tragically, a malevolent wind descended upon the city, tossing about burning cotton, and soon flames were raging everywhere in the city. It's been 7 years ago, but to this day I don't understand. But certain ill-advised residents of the city supplied our soldiers with spirits. As a matter of fact, whiskey by the bucket, with obvious results. And to compound matters, several hundred of our officers and soldiers had been in captivity in that city in dreadful conditions. And upon being loosened from their bonds, were less than kind in their attitude towards their former captors. So yes, certain of our soldiers did set fires, but I hasten to add, General Sherman and the entire staff were up virtually the whole night, supervising firefighting efforts, attempting to limit looting, and being of assistance to innocent civilians.
Thank you, Major Hammond. As an Assistant Adjutant General and a military expert, did General Sherman ever issue any orders regarding pillaging and looting?
Well, indeed he did.
Would you tell the court about them, please?
Certainly, sir. On September 15, 1862, at General Sherman's behest, I prepared and caused to be issued General Order Number 82, which was in full force and effect throughout the war. Now, the overall effect of 82 was to address the matter of captured property, with the same being directed to go into appropriate government hands for distribution to the divisions. For example, perhaps this would help, arms and ammunition to the ordnance officers, provisions to the division commissaries, medical supplies to the division surgeons, wagons, horses, mules, saddles, harness, and the like to the various quartermasters. Now, the order also specifically prohibited any officer or soldier from appropriating to his own use any captured property, with violators deemed guilty of peculation to be tried by general court-martial. The order also specifically required any officer or soldier presently in possession of any article of captured property of any nature to immediately turn it in to the appropriate government agent. Later, I believe in November of 1862, a shorter order was issued. This order specifically prohibited any officer or soldier from entering any private dwelling or committing trespass. Now, while it's true, liberal foraging was understood, it was going to happen. However, only articles necessary for the sustenance of the army were to be seized, with obvious exception granted to widows, orphans, and the destitute.
And those were the obvious exceptions that were covered by the order, sir?
Yes, sir.
I have nothing further, Your Honor.
Thank you, counsel. You may cross-examine.
Thank you, Your Honor. I must say, Major Hammond, your meticulous detailing of Order 82, why, and I'm certain its punctilious observance by the soldiers under General Sherman's command lead me to infer why they were virtual choir members as they marched through my region. I can't quite accept that, however, so I must ask you, sir, even though the details of the fire that swept Columbia may be arguable, would you offer any comment on the hundreds of incidents of arson elsewhere before Columbia, after Columbia, that characterized the treacherous and soot-laden path of General Sherman's army?
Well, first of all, sir, you have used the word arson in a rather universal sense, and that it was simply not the case. Arson connoting the commission of a crime. Our army was under specific orders to break up General Johnson's army, to get into the interior of the enemy's country as far as possible, and to do all possible damage to the enemy's war resources. Might I suggest, sir, that the shelling or burning or otherwise destruction of public or government buildings or any other facility which aided in the rebels' war efforts were acts of war and not criminal conduct. Granted, criminal arson took place, but it was done by those damnable stragglers who hung behind and wouldn't fight and were a despicable disgrace. These deplorable acts were not done by any organized body of officers or soldiers, and were certainly not with the approval of or under the orders of General Sherman.
At the same time, Major, in an army, isn't it ultimately the responsibility of the commanding officer to take responsibility, certainly to have cognizance of all actions conducted by soldiers under his command, and if in fact those actions surpass appropriateness into wanton arson, isn't it his responsibility to see that these soldiers are punished? And do you know of any such instances by General Sherman?
Well, sir, you've asked several questions in one. First of all, of course, the commander is responsible for the actions of his soldiers acting under his orders, and I emphasize the words acting under his orders. Similar to what you lawyers talk about, I believe, the principles of agency. General Sherman never issued any order directed towards the destruction of private property. Now, as to the balance of your question. When caught, offenders were tried and punished. Some were summarily shot. Perhaps it would be of assistance to provide to the court several examples. I recall in the Columbia nightmare, myself and several other officers were attempting to subdue a drunken soldier. When the man continued to resist, and he was a large man, much larger than I, another officer, whose rank and name I don't recall, drew his revolver and shot the man. In another instance, several soldiers were caught having looted women's clothing. Now, these scoundrels were roped to the back of one of our wagons. They were dressed in the women's clothing and forced to march behind the wagon for a full week. I must comment further, sir, on the matter of destruction, and God only knows there was destruction. But it cannot and should not and must not be laid upon the shoulders of our army. Quite frankly, Rebel General Wheeler's cavalry had quite a reputation for pillaging and burning and looting their own people's property, as well as living quite handsomely off the land at the expense of the citizens. And while it may be disagreeable for you to hear, sir, a number of the citizens informed us that our soldiers were rank amateurs compared to Wheeler's cavalry.
Major Hammond, we are touched by your testimony that General Sherman never issued any orders calling for the destruction or damage of private property. One might only judge that given the well-known common rascality of the average Union soldier, sir, he never needed to issue those orders. I would like to say to the court that while we have noted its objection to the term Yankee, we will not, on behalf of the prosecution, issue any complaint against the term rebel, although it is one of dishonor and invidious nature to my soul.
Is that a question, sir?
It is not a comment. We have concluded our questions of this witness.
Thank you, counsel. Anything further for this witness? General Williams, sir, do you have any questions?
Yes, sir, it might be helpful, Major Hammond, if you have a copy of General Order 82 with you.
Indeed, General, I have, sir. Captain, perhaps you can hand this to the general.
Thank you.
Thank you, Captain.
I have nothing further.
Anything further?
We have nothing further, Your Honor.
Anything further from the prosecution?
Nothing, Your
You
Honor.
may step down, Major. Thank you for your testimony. You may call your next witness.
The defense calls Senator John Sherman.
Senator John Sherman.
You swear that the evidence you shall give in this case now in hearing to be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do, sir.
Sir, please state your name, residence, and occupation.
John Sherman, United States Senator from Ohio, presently residing in Washington City, sir.
Sir, you are the brother of the renowned General William Tecumseh Sherman?
Yes, sir, I am.
Remember the bayonet, sir. Senator Sherman, as a distinguished member of the United States Senate during the War of Southern Rebellion, did you ever have the opportunity to discuss and become familiar with the Lincoln administration's view of General Sherman's conduct of military operations?
Many times, sir, I had discussions with not only President Lincoln, Secretary Stanton, General Halleck, and many members of Congress. And the only thing that they did was to not only approve, but applaud his actions.
Thank you, sir. Senator Sherman, during this hearing, it's been implied that General Sherman has borne an inexorable hatred for the South and for the people of the South, and that his actions have reflected this hatred. Would you respond to this unfounded allegation, please?
Sir, absolutely nothing could be further from the truth. My brother was first stationed at Fort Moultrie in South Carolina, in Charleston, where he made many friends and was there quite a while. Then he worked in Georgia surveying in his military career. And at the outbreak of hostilities, he was teaching at Louisiana Military Academy. Now, he has got many friends and has had many heartaches over what has happened to the South. But better than anyone else, he knew of the tenacity that the Southern people had, so that the only way to end this rebellion was for him to not only affect the military, but let the public know that war was not the thing to do.
Sir, there's no possible way for General Sherman's name to be sullied as long as he continues to tell the truth, is there?
Absolutely none, sir.
Thank you, sir. I have no further questions.
Thank you, counsel. You may cross-examine.
Senator, now, isn't it true that you are the brother of the respondent, General William Sherman?
Proudly, sir.
And wouldn't it be fair to say that you're not particularly interested in having the family name dragged through the mud by adverse findings of this court?
Sir, there are no way.
No further questions.
Sir, may I respond
your
to
witness.
this question, sir?
The court is inclined to give the witness full latitude. You may speak to the court, sir.
Yes, sir, rather than being cut off, there is no way that the name of Sherman can be hurt by the truth. And that's what this hearing will bring out. And I applaud my brother for asking for this hearing so that all the scribblers and all of the lies in the past and the falsehoods can be dissuaded. Thank you.
Thank you. You may be excused. You may call your next witness.
Your Honor, the defense begs the court's indulgence to ask the adjutant to ask the court to rise.
You may, sir.
All rise. The defense calls as its next witness the President of the United States of America, Ulysses S. Grant.
The President of the United States of America, Ulysses S. Grant.
Sir, do you swear that the evidence you shall give in this case now in hearing shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I will, sir.
Be seated.
Your Excellency, it's an honor to address you, and it's an honor to have served under you. Would you please state your name, residence, and current occupation?
Well, sir, when I was born, my parents named me Hiram Ulysses Grant. Upon attending the military academy at West Point, through an error of the quartermaster, he saw fit to christen me Ulysses Simpson Grant, Simpson coming from my mother's maiden name, and after matriculation from the academy, I never saw fit to change it. Now I presently reside as a result of being elected president in Washington City.
Thank you, sir. So we're familiar with your illustrious military career. Will you briefly relate to the court something of your background and your relationship to the respondent, General William Tecumseh Sherman?
Well, sir, as I just mentioned, General Sherman and I did attend West Point Academy together, except that I should qualify. I was only a first-year student while Cump was a fourth-year student, so I would think it would be fair to say that we were merely acquaintances. It was after the War of the Rebellion began that I actually came to know General Sherman and respect General Sherman, both as a comrade and friend.
And as General Sherman's commanding officer, you were, of course, aware of his plans for feeding his army during the March to the Sea, and you approved of these plans, is that correct?
Well, sir, during the War of the Rebellion, I was elevated to the rank of commander of all the federal forces, so of course I was aware of General Sherman's plans. I had to approve them.
And did you agree that General Sherman's abandoning of traditional supply lines was unorthodox?
Unorthodox, yes. When General Sherman came to me with his plan for Atlanta and continued march to the sea, I must admit I had some doubt as to his possible success. To my knowledge, no army to that point have ever successfully left their lines of supply and been able to do much battle. But I felt that if any commanding officer was to do it, it was General Sherman. And let's bear in mind that his attack, an eminent march to the sea, took place shortly after harvest when all the stores and larders were full.
And to your knowledge, the President Lincoln and his administration and Secretary of War Stanton were aware of these unorthodox plans, is that correct?
Yes, sir, they were. I did tell President Lincoln and also Secretary Stanton about General Sherman's plan. In fact, President Lincoln asked that I wait a day or two to make sure that there would be no factors that might hinder his advance. I knew from the outset that this was the only plan that was going to work. General Sherman had to move swiftly to drive his enemy to the sea and defeat. If he was to wait on supplies to keep up with his armies, there was no way he would be able to do that.
So it is your testimony that they did have knowledge and approve of these plans?
Indeed, sir, they did.
Sir, you've heard testimony describing the liberal foraging as an act of barbarity and uncivilized. As a military expert, which of course you certainly are, what is your assessment of the tactics that General Sherman's army employed during his march to the sea?
You use the words barbarity and uncivilized. Is there anything in war that is not barbaric or uncivilized? General Sherman foraged from the land to sustain his troops who were defending this country against the enemy of the Union. Those same supplies would have been used by his enemies to bring cruelty and chaos to the North. I have the utmost respect for General Sherman and his tactics.
Thank you, sir. Again, it's been an honor addressing you. Sir, I have no further questions.
Thank you, counsel. Prosecution may cross-examine.
Thank you indeed, Your Honor. Mr. President. Mr. President, would you agree that the common customs and usages of war require that once an enemy combatant surrenders, that he is to be afforded decent treatment and kept free of unnecessary risk of harm?
As a general proposition, yes, sir.
Then how would you reconcile, Mr. President, General Sherman's express orders to use Confederate prisoners of war to serve as vanguard down the roads which were thought or known to be mined by torpedoes?
Sir, if you are talking right now about those subterranean shells, those torpedoes, as you call them, these weapons, which are the weapons of cowards, were invented by the South. They maimed, they wounded, they killed soldiers, not expecting a fight, simply marching toward their aggressors. They buried them. They should dig them up.
We note, Mr. President, your terminology, the weapons of cowards. I will only pass in comment that General Sherman's march through my state with 60,000 troops against the women and children of the state of Georgia led the late hero, General Lee, to have remarked, I wonder at the acclaim being heaped on General Sherman during his march through Georgia, when the only question that faced him was whether he could feed his army by taking everything the people had to eat. My final question, Mr. President. You indicated in your testimony that you were aware of and approved of General Sherman's plan to liberally forage and sustain his forces off the land. In your mind, Mr. President, did that include looting and pillaging innocent civilians and burning women and children from their homes?
As I said earlier, sir, being commanding general, certainly I had awareness of his plan, and I approved his plan. As far as the destruction of civilian property and the burning and pillaging, unfortunately, that's what war is. War is a tragedy. It's a human tragedy brought forth by one group against another. During the course of this great conflict, remember, there were losses on both sides. People weren't sure of what the morrow would bring. General Sherman, through his valiant efforts, and I believe history will show him to be a great patriot and hero, through his valiant efforts, was able to shorten the length of this conflict, therefore giving people hope. I think we all owe General Sherman a debt of gratitude. For whatever bit of success I have, I owe to that man.
Some of us will withhold the expression of that debt of gratitude, Mr. President. The prosecution has no further questions, Your Honor.
Thank you, counsel. Anything further?
We have one further question.
Yes, you may inquire.
Your Excellency, as General William Tecumseh Sherman's commanding general during the War of Southern Rebellion, are you aware of any action in Georgia or the Carolinas on the part of General Sherman that would cause you to censor him?
Absolutely none, sir. He had many opportunities to bring about more death and destruction, but chose not to. Let me give you one example. When he had taken the city of Savannah during its occupation, there was a blockade runner, I believe it sailed from England, that entered the port. General Sherman would have been completely within the rules of war to send that vessel to the bottom. But he chose not to do so and instead allowed it to dock. The captain was unaware that it was in possession of Federal Army hands at this point. He disembarked from his ship, walked to the customs house, and at that time was informed that ship now became the possession of the Union armies. General Sherman, of course, then unloaded those stores to supply our own troops.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Sir, I have no further questions.
Prosecution have any cross-examination?
We do not, Your Honor.
Thank you very much for your presence here today, President Grant. We're duly honored. Thank you, sir.
You may be seated.
Defense may call your next witness.
Your Honor, the defense calls General William Tecumseh Sherman.
Do you swear that the evidence you shall give in this case now pending to be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do, sir.
You may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. General Sherman, you are the respondent in the case now in hearing.
I am, sir.
General Sherman, would you please relate for the court some of your reasons for asking for this court of inquiry?
Yes, sir. I've asked for this court in order that I might more effectively discharge my duties as General-in-Chief of the United States Army. And in addition to that, to dispel the rumors and to uncover the falsehoods that have been disseminated by certain newspaper scribblers, their editors, and book writers.
Thank you, General. General, you've heard the testimony and the allegations brought before this court today. Let's briefly review them. As to the shelling of Atlanta and the forced evacuation of the population, what say you?
Despite what you've heard here today, sir, General Hood established his lines of defense so close to the town of Atlanta that all of our cannon shot, many of our musket shells and shot from our line of investment entered the habitations of women and children. General Hardee did this same thing at Jonesboro. And earlier in the war, General Johnson had done it at Jackson, Mississippi. Sir, I say to you that Atlanta was heavily fortified. It was stubbornly defended, and we won it, and rightly so. And as captors, we had every right to it, sir. Had we allowed the civilians there to remain in that city, we would have been faced with a choice of feeding them or seeing them starve. Neither one of those alternatives is acceptable to us, sir. Had we allowed them to remain, there would have been all kind of requests for provost marshals, and my officers would have been tied down with hundreds of non-military items to attend to. But let me point this out, sir, that the removal of civilians was not unprecedented. Confederate General Johnson, wisely and prudently, I might add, engaged in this type of practice all the way from Dalton down to Atlanta.
Thank you, General. General, did Confederate General Hood, the commander of Atlanta, ever ask that Atlanta be considered an open city?
No, sir, he did not.
Explain to the court, General Sherman, what General Hood would have lost if he had asked you to declare Atlanta an open city.
You are right, General Hood did not request that Atlanta be made an open city, and quite frankly, sir, the reason was it was not to his advantage to do so. Had he done this, he would have lost Atlanta as a rail hub. He would have lost Atlanta as a marshaling area for troops. He would have lost Atlanta, the storeroom that provided his army with arms, ammunition, and accoutrements. No, sir, as we've said, General Hood did not request that Atlanta be named an open city, and as I said, it was because it was not in his interest to do so. And when General Hood made that fateful decision, it was the citizens of Atlanta that were the losers, sir.
General Sherman, did you ever issue an order or even intimate that the city of Columbia, South Carolina should be burned?
The fact, sir, that I, General Howard, General Logan, both General Woodses made our headquarters in homes in areas that later burned brands this suggestion as a complete falsehood. Why, only the most idiotic would continue to accept that as being true. But as to the burning of Atlanta, or of Columbia, I never ordered it, never really wanted it, sir. But at the same time, I never shed any tears over it, because I feel that it hastened what we were all fighting for, the end of the war.
General Sherman, who started the War of Rebellion?
Those in rebellion, sir.
General Sherman, who seized federal property without provocation?
Again, sir, those in rebellion.
General Sherman, who dared the federal government to enforce the Constitution?
Those in rebellion against the legal and lawful government of the United States, sir.
I have nothing further.
Objection, Your Honor. Constitutional questions are beyond the purview of this court.
The court will take his remarks in due regard. You may cross-examine.
General Sherman, isn't it true that your usage of Confederate prisoners as a vanguard or a forlorn hope ahead of your columns and traveling through areas known to be mined with torpedoes violated the commonly accepted usages and customs of war?
Sir, you speak of violating commonly accepted usages?
Yeah, I do, sir.
Customs and rules of warfare? What greater misuse of those rules and conduct of war than the Confederate using hidden, buried torpedoes on the causeway as we approached Savannah? These infernal devices, as you've heard here already, did nothing but maim and wound scores of my men. There was no engagement here, sir. No shelling, no skirmishing of any type. This was not war, sir. This was murder. And it made me very angry, sir. At no time did I or any of the men under my command subject captured Confederate officers or men to anything like the mistreatment that was afforded Union prisoners, sir.
Well, wouldn't it be fair to say that during your campaign through the Carolinas and Georgia that the armed forces under your command were responsible for committing the most misery and damage inflicted upon a people since the days of Attila the Hun?
I have never, sir, felt it necessary, nor felt disposed, I might add, to apologize, nor excuse anything I did to shorten the war. I am convinced, sir, that my campaigns and my style of warfare did indeed shorten the war and thereby save thousands of lives. In addition to that, sir, I am convinced that my style of warfare, total warfare, was legitimate warfare and furthermore brought about wholly by the actions of the South. One moment, sir. One moment. I have not finished. I have not finished.
Please, go on.
War, sir, is cruelty. There is nothing you can do to refine that. To those who would rebel against a government that was as kind and as just as ours was, a punishment, sir, in return is not unjust. But, having said that, allow me to point out that the physical treatment to the Southern civilians was outstanding, sir. When my army occupied Savannah, we found living there the wives of 3 Confederate generals. General Hardee, Gustavus Smith, and Anderson had made no attempt in the weeks preceding my army's occupation of that city to remove their wives, to remove their families. Proof to me that they felt certain of the fair and the honorable treatment their families would be entertained with.
Is it not a fair representation to say that you, as commander of your army, lost control of your quote-unquote bummers? And to the point that they're pillaged and looted and burned the countryside?
I cannot accept that premise, sir. I disagree completely. Now, there may have been incidents where stragglers and deserters of both armies, sir, engaged in pillaging and burning. But on the other hand, my bummers were under orders, sir, direct orders to supply the army with all of its needs each and every day. And the fact that they successfully completed that task served both their army and their general and their country well. But, sir, there was an added benefit to this foraging that sometimes we do not take into consideration. That was the power of terror. The Southern civilians were of terror of these Western soldiers, of these bummers. Sir, that terror crippled those Southern civilians to the point of where they were completely ineffective. I used that power of terror, sir, and I used it to the utmost. Yes, sir, to the utmost.
I concur. No further questions?
Thank you, counsel. Anything further?
We have nothing further, Your Honor.
You may step down, General. Thank you very much for your testimony before the court. Are counsel ready to proceed with your closing arguments?
We are, Your Honor.
The defense ready to proceed?
We are, Your Honor.
The prosecution may open with their arguments at this time.
Thank you indeed, Your Honor. It falls incumbent now upon the prosecution to summarize the evidence that has been placed before the court, specifically regarding the 4 charges against General Sherman. 1, did he attack undefended locales or undefended civilians, causing unnecessary suffering to them? Yes, he did. I think we saw that immediately. Mayor Calhoun's testimony talks about the shelling, and even General Sherman talks of the shelling. It did happen. The question, however, was it justified? But let's stick to the evidence. Let's stick to the charges. 2, allowing pillage or plunder of towns, villages, or other properties, failing to maintain proper command or control over subordinates. Why, Mr. Gibbs alone has told us what happened in Columbia. Again, it happened. Whether or not it was justified, I believe, falls upon the defense to worry about. 3, reprisal and dishonorable treatment of prisoners of war by forcing them to participate in military operations at the risk of their life and safety. Yeah, Mr. President, you yourself confirmed that this was, even though you characterized it as a cowardly weapon, you confirmed, yes, it did happen. 4, reprisals against the persons and property of non-combatant civilians by confiscating items such as food, etc. Why, Mrs. Burge, your heartrending story, ma'am. So, in other words, Your Honor, it did in fact happen. That's not the issue here, and I suspect that's not even the reason that General Sherman has called this court of inquiry into session, not to deny the truth. Why, even the scribblers of the press, with their well-known wanton excesses, why, the facts are not in dispute. This happened, and I have thousands of kinsmen and fellow Southerners who will attest to it. But the question tonight, and if it please the court, the question before you all is, was it justified? Or, even better tonight, can General Sherman be justified in this behavior or condoning or allowing the behavior of his troops? Well, he has sought to justify it by placing him before us, y'all, in the guise of an angelic humanitarian. Oh, I had to clean out the South in order to end the war more quickly and bring the happy tidings of peace. Great Scott, peace bought at what price, General Sherman? Were you worried about justifying the burnings and other carryings on when you were watching them? For example, it is well known down where I am that in November, the courthouse of Marietta, where I happen to be from, was under flames, and I think it was Major Hitchcock asked you, aren't you worried about what history you will say? How will you justify this? And I believe, sir, your words. It doesn't matter. I will tell him Jeff Davis did it. I've never understood, sir, your meaning by that. Now, who else beyond yourself can justify you? Well, I cite a document that the court knows well, General Orders Number 100 from the U.S. War Department of April of 1863, and I quote, "Men who take up arms against one another in public war do not cease on this account to be moral beings responsible to one another and to God." Well, in truth, when General Hood used the name of the Almighty and implored that you not throw out and expel the citizens of Atlanta, appealing to God, you wrote back, "I ask you not to appeal to a just God in such a sacrilegious manner." My God, sir, if we cannot appeal to the divinity, when our very lives are at stake, then where else will we find justification, General Sherman? It is apparent that you are not even seeking the justification of the Almighty in your doings. Finally, you say and you seek your own justification in terms of my style of warfare, the power of terror, and its presumed beneficent effects in bringing about a speedier peace. General Sherman, I will say that we in the South are awfully glad the war ended as quickly as it did, despite its 4 years' horrible duration. General Sherman, we fear down in the South what might have happened had the war continued its awful course, and you might have practiced the power of terror and sharpened the bloody knife of your style of warfare. Is it not true, General Sherman, that in August of '62 you wrote your foster father, as to, I quote, as to changing the opinions of the people of the South, that is impossible, and they must be killed or dispossessed. Quite frankly, y'all, we're glad we were just dispossessed. To General Grant, December 28, 1866, regarding the Plains Indians. We must act with vindictive earnestness against the Sioux, even to their extermination, men, women, and children. And, of course, even to your wife, Ellen, in July of '62. The war will soon assume a turn to extermination, not of soldiers alone. That is the least part of the trouble, but of the people. General Sherman, I will say that if you can justify the wholesale slaughter of women and children in the interest of a happy and speedier peace, then, sir, I do not believe that we are seeking justification on the same ethical planet. Nonetheless, I have no doubt but that you will find justification, not from God, whom you have eschewed, but from this court in its power of mercy and clemency. Probably also because, in truth, General Sherman, your style of warfare was not originally practiced by you. You will find justification, I am certain, because while you were military governor, while Colonel Turchin was with his troops and brigands burning and looting the city of Athens, Alabama. Even before you assumed field command out of Memphis, General Pope was raising barns in central Virginia. So there were other practitioners of hard war, General Sherman. It's just that you seem to be wounded a little bit more than they by the imputations surrounding that kind of criminal war making. But that's all right. Another reason that I happen to think that you will find justification is, in fact, General Halleck, when you sought permission after the capture of my city to embark upon your march through Georgia, you asked, and General Halleck did approve, removing Atlanta's populace, cleaning out the country, denying the people the right to find subsistence and forage. General Halleck also approved even the destruction of factories and other military or economically useful facilities. Thank you, General Halleck. You did at least stop by saying, no, but I don't approve of General Hunter's policy of burning private homes. Well, we all know what Yankee soldiers will do when they are excited. Will he be justified tonight, y'all? He will be justified without question. I say to my brothers and sisters from the South, the conclusion is foregone. I will walk away from this courtroom, confident, however, that I have done my duty, not in securing a prosecution verdict. I knew that was not going to happen. Because I do know that General Sherman will be justified here tonight. It is worse, y'all. I do happen to think that General Sherman will not only be justified for the heinous crimes of his soldiers, but he will be lionized throughout the rest of American history as a hero and savior to this country. And what is worse? General Sherman, I do happen to think that this is your burden. Regardless of the ultimate and inevitable exoneration and justification you'll find here tonight, I do happen to think that this is your burden. That even though others practiced hard war, you will become its hero. Not because you were the most vindictive practitioner of hard war. Where's General Sheridan when we wanted, well, please pardon me. There were other practitioners of hard war, but you will be justified and made the hero of it, sir, because you found intellectual rationale in it. You turned it from something wretched and inhumane and made it some act of heroism saving the nation. This will be your burden. If this is your justification, General Sherman, I will say that it is bought at a dear price. Yes, the prosecution will rest, Your Honor, because we have failed in our fight, which was foregone. But I walk out of here with my friends and neighbors, having felt that we have done our duty, even though justification can be handed down at a military court of inquiry. I do happen to think that it is bought at the cost of nobility, decency, and civility. All those ideas, even in warfare, that could have been once enshrined. But no, y'all. Nobility, civility, and decency are trampled in the Southland, dug into the ground and red clay of Georgia by the heels of 100,000 Yankee soldiers, sir, commanded by you. The prosecution rests, Your Honor.
Thank you, counsel. The defense may proceed with your closing argument.
We will proceed with our closing argument, Your Honor. We will not insult the integrity of this court by assuming that there is a foregone conclusion. Your Honor, allow me to recite an abbreviated resume of the services General Sherman provided to his country in the late War of the Rebellion. Remember his tenacious defense on April 6, 1862 at Shiloh that saved General Grant's army. Remember his active assistance in all of General Grant's attempts to capture Vicksburg, including the reduction of Arkansas Post. Remember his brave and powerful attack at the city of Vicksburg, hastening the surrender of that Gibraltar and allowing the Mississippi to flow unvexed to the sea. Remember the relief of General Rosecrans' trapped Union army in Chattanooga, saving that army for the Union cause. Remember the enormous undertaking of approaching, surrounding, and capturing Atlanta. Remember the march to the sea and the capture of Savannah. Remember the winter march through South Carolina, including the capture of Charleston and Columbia. A march which caused Confederate General Joseph Johnston to remark, "The world has not seen the likes of Sherman's army since Caesar's legions trod the earth." Remember the crowning victory at Bentonville, the capture of the Army of Tennessee, the Confederate Army commanded by General Johnston at Durham Station, North Carolina. Now, Your Honors, the defense has shown that General Sherman never ordered the destruction of Columbia, South Carolina, and he did everything he could do to prevent it. We have also shown on the defense that General Sherman never ordered the pillaging of farms of innocent civilians and actually issued orders against pillaging. Your Honor, the defense has shown that General Sherman had no implacable hatred for the people of the South, but to the contrary, enjoyed the South and its people. Your Honor, remember the generous terms of surrender offered by General Sherman to General Johnston at Durham Station. Terms that were so lenient they were rejected by the politicians in Washington City. Your Honor, the defense has shown you that through the testimony of President Grant and that of Senator Sherman, that the Lincoln administration approved and authorized the actions and tactics of General Sherman. Your Honor, the theory of the prosecution is simple. Judge General Sherman as if no war was going on. you must forget Southern depredations. Arsenals seized, Fort Sumter fired on without provocation, Federal troops imprisoned at the beginning of the war who had never fought, Chambersburg, Pennsylvania burned, Union prisoners starved and mistreated in hellholes like Andersonville. You must forget the fact that Southern armies drew supplies freely from the farms of the region where they were stationed and operating. Forget that Southern factories provided the necessary industrial tools that a modern army needs to continue fighting. Forget the fact that Southern cities served as supply, communications, and headquarters hubs, supporting the rebel armies operating in the field. Your Honor, you must forget that Southern cavalry committed foraging depredations on their own people and blamed it on General Sherman and his army. Your Honor, you must forget the Southern aristocracy's obsession with cotton, which caused them to burn warehouses in heavily populated industrial areas rather than allow the wonderful crop to fall into the hands of the dreaded Yankees. Your Honor, you must forget that Southern armies used cities as defensive bulwarks, hiding their troops and their supplies, their factories. You must forget that General Hood, the Confederate commander of Atlanta, never asked for Atlanta to be declared an open city, free of military use, and not a target. In summary, Your Honor, the prosecution wants this court to judge General Sherman's actions against the standard of peaceful civility and not against a standard of brutal war. Your Honor, to paraphrase the respondent, war is all hell. You cannot refine it. Remember who started that barbarous and uncivilized war, and remember the hero who ended it.
Thank you, counsel. Anything further from the prosecution?
No, Your Honor.
Having heard the testimony of the witnesses and the closing arguments of counsel, the court will now retire to chamber to take up its deliberations.
All
Captain
rise. You may be seated.
Before the court announces its decision, I'm going to call on General Sheridan and General Williams to make a brief statement at this time. General Sheridan, would you like to proceed, sir?
Thank you, sir. In the course of my lifelong career in the services of this country, I have found hindsight to offer many alternatives to the course of action originally chosen. The testimony tonight has provided some evidence of this. Obviously, the emotions and sentiments are as strong as the conflict was intense and long. The question is not whether the atrocities experienced could have been avoided, but if the actions taken by General Sherman were proper, given the objectives which he was given. We now need to move forward as the conflict in question has come to an end. We as a nation must now focus on the protection of our future. Thank you.
Thank you, General Sheridan. General Williams, sir.
Thank you, General Halleck. I've been a soldier for almost 40 years. I'm always amazed by the number of armchair generals, especially in the press, who without benefit of military education or service attempt to dictate policy to those engaged in the field. These military critics are long and loud from the safety of their home and hearth. But such critics are rare in the ranks of volunteers for field service and active duty. The war was an American tragedy that hurt all of us. Our country, North and South, must move forward. We hope our decision tonight will help to make that happen.
General Howard. Thank you, General Williams. I would like to read a letter which was written to General Sherman, dated September the 28th, 1864, over the signature of myself, General Halleck, from the War Department in Washington City. And I would like to quote that letter as follows. General, the course you have pursued in removing rebel families from Atlanta and then the exchange of prisoners is fully approved by the War Department. Not only are you justified by the laws and usages of war in removing these people, but I think it was your duty to your own army to do so. The safety of our armies and a proper regard for the lives of our soldiers require that we apply to our inexorable foes severe rules of war. We are certainly not required to treat the so-called non-combatant rebels better than they themselves treat each other. They strip their own families of provisions, leaving them, as our army advances, to be fed by us. We have fed this class of people long enough. I would destroy every mill and factory within reach which I did not want for my own use. Thus the rebels have done also. I have endeavored to impress these views upon other commanders for the last 2 years. You, sir, are amongst the only one, almost the only one, who has properly applied them. I do not approve of the burning of private houses. This is barbarous. But I approve of taking or destroying whatever may serve as supplies to us or to the enemy's army. At this time, the court will announce its decision. I want to remind those in attendance that this court of inquiry was requested by General Sherman. The burden of proof is upon the prosecution to prove the charges brought here today by clear and convincing evidence. The decisions that I am going to announce are the unanimous decision of this court, approved by both General Sheridan and by General Williams and myself. I will take up the charges one by one and will announce the court's decision. Charge number 1, attack upon undefended locales and civilians causing unnecessary suffering. Not proven. Charge number 2, allowing the pillage and plunder of towns and failing to maintain proper control over his troops. Not proven. Charge number 3, reprisal and dishonorable treatment of prisoners of war by forcing them into military operations of risk. Not proven. Charge number 4, reprisal against the persons and property of non-combatants by confiscating foodstuffs and livestock essential to the survival of the civilian population. Not proven. That concludes the deliberations of the court. I want to thank counsel for the prosecution for the professional manner in which they presented their case. I wish to also thank defense counsel for the professional manner in which you have presented the defense. And General Sherman, thank you, sir, for your appearance here today. With that, the court stands adjourned.
All rise.